Okay, one interesting aspect of the opioid story, the research story, is how the effects of opioids, these analgesic effects, have been known about for a very long time, because opioids have been consumed or utilized in cultures around the world, for particularly for the analgesic effects. Then the question arose: well, where are these opioid chemicals acting, in the brain or in the nervous system? And then scientists looked, and they used a lot of the techniques that we talked about earlier to identify the distribution of three specific subtypes of opioid receptor. There's the mu opioid receptors, there are the delta opioid receptors, and the kappa opioid receptors. And there are differences in terms of their distribution. They're definitely found in areas like the spinal cord, where they can help to block the transmission of nociceptive information from the body to maps in the brain. Also the brain stem, where they can affect sort of descending control over that upflow of nociceptive information. And also in other parts of the brain as well, including significant components of the these sort of reinforcement, these dopaminergic mesolimbic networks, like in the nucleus accumbens. And so the receptors then, were identified, and their distribution was mapped, after we knew about the effects for, millennia. And then the next question that arose, of course, is, well, what in our bodies, not a drug that's introduced, externally, from external sources, what do we release? What does our brain or body release, that actually acts at these specific opioid receptors that were identified, the mu, the delta and the kappa receptors. And so the hunt was on then for, the actual transmitters, the endogenous opioids, right? And it turns out that these are primarily what we call peptide neurotransmitters. These are short proteins, right? Sometimes they're actually peptide hormones, because these are short proteins that are released into the blood and can travel all through the systemic circulation and reach targets like all over the place, including the spinal cord and brainstem and brain. And a short peptide is produced typically because the cell that's going to release it basically will express a gene for a larger protein, and then also express a gene for an enzyme that can cleave out a smaller segment, this short peptide opioid, for release. And I'm going to give you one example of sort of a peptide that was identified, an opioid peptide, but that's actually released from a gland cell in the brain, from the pituitary gland, under circumstances of stress. So there's a larger protein that's expressed in these pituitary cells that's called POMC. And then these cells express enzymes that'll cut out a small peptide called beta endorphin, and also another little peptide hormone called ACTH, which is part of the HPA axis, the stress response. And both ACTH and beta endorphin, the opioid peptide, are released into the blood under circumstances of stress. And this leads to that phenomenon, right, where if you if you fall off your bike, or if you get in a car accident, or you have some kind of a serious stressful circumstance where you're actually also physically injured, you often don't feel that pain, because you've released, as part of this HPA axis, as part of this stress response, your own endogenous opioid hormone, in this case beta endorphin, which will block the transmission of nociceptive information about injury to